Thank you so much, my participants and the audience for joining us today for our policy roundtable in local responses to economic crisis in the MENA region. We have two esteemed policy experts and practitioners joining us today for this important roundtable. We have our first speaker, who is Gladys Lopez, who is a lead economist and a program lead in the World Bank Poverty and Equity Global Practice. And she works primarily in the Middle East and North Africa region. Her areas of analytical and operational interest include trade, welfare, gender, conflict, and jobs. Previously, she was a lead economist in the World Bank, in the World Bank Chief Economist Office for the South Asia region, and senior economist in the World Bank Center Vice Presidency Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Unit in the Latin America and the Caribbean region at the World Bank. She's a research fellow of the Institute of Labor Economics, a Mexican National Research System, and the Economic Research Forum. Prior to joining the World Bank, she held high-level positions at the government of Mexico, and she was a professor at ITAM. And she holds a BA bachelor degree in economics from ITAM and a PhD in economics from University of Virginia. And then we have our next speaker, who is Dr. Nader Kabbani, a senior fellow, director of research, and director of governance and development program with the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Kabbani also serves as non-resident fellow with the foreign policy program at Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and research fellow with the Economic Research Forum based in Cairo, a development researcher and practitioner with over 20 years of experience. Kabbani served as senior fellow and director of research with the Brookings Center and director of policy and research at the Syria Foundation. He was a founding director of the Syrian Development Research Center at the Syria Trust for Development. During his career, Kabbani held positions on the economics faculty of American University of Beirut and a research staff of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the California State Senate. He has worked as a consultant for several international organizations, including the World Bank, the International Labor Organization, and the UNDP, and he has served on several advisory boards of nonprofit organizations and social enterprises. He published policy papers, academic articles on a wide variety of development issues, mostly covering the MENA region. He has a BA from Claremont College and a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. So first, I would like to welcome both of you. We're so excited to have you today. It's such a pleasure to have you to talk about this very timely topic, an economic crisis in the Middle East. So I would like to start the discussion. And again, just every time I forget to introduce myself after I introduce my speakers. And this is Marwa Shalabi, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Again, I'm also a political scientist, and I work on issues related to the Middle East and North Africa. So before we move to kind of a more focus on local perspective on these issues, I would like to start with Nader and ask you first for our audience and to give us kind of a quick overview of the economic performance of the MENA region over the past decade and the most urgent challenges currently facing MENA's economies.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, or good morning in some places. Thank you so much, Marwa, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to join you on this panel today. So the Middle East is going through a difficult time economically. Let's start with economic growth. I mean, over the past decade, economic growth in the MENA region has averaged around 2.5% per year, which is less than the global average of around 3% during that same time. It's actually expected to or projected to fall to under 2% in 2023. So the situation is not improving. But even with these figures, they really don't adequately capture the collapse of economic activity and the overall economic losses in conflict countries such as Syria, Yemen, and Sudan. And if you start incorporating that, then the region really is lagging behind. Economic growth across the region is also not entirely stable because it relies disproportionately on revenues from oil and natural gas. This is obvious in oil exporting countries, such as in the Gulf, which, where the economic activity rises and falls very much with the price of oil. And the reason is because the other economic activities are tied to that. Activities such as construction and some hospitality and others. So that those are all tied to the oil sector indirectly. And so their fortunes also tend to rise and fall with oil prices. But even in oil importing countries across the region, they benefit from oil indirectly through investments, remittances, and development assistance. And remittances is a very big component because of the large numbers of Middle Eastern workers here who send money back home to their families and their countries. Economic growth in the region has also been propped up recently by excessive public borrowing. So since 2010, public debt levels as a share of GDP, for example, in Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan collectively have increased by over about 15%. Together with Lebanon and Bahrain, they've now passed 80% of GDP in all those countries. And you can start seeing what the consequences of that, especially in prolonged cases of prolonged debt in Lebanon, for example, you end up with a financial meltdown that drags the entire economy along with it. So the region is in I would say a precarious economic position as a result. Okay, moving beyond economic growth and looking at issues of poverty and inequality, those are all also kind of very worrisome. They're on the rise in the region. The MENA region is the only region across the world where poverty at the $3.50 line has increased over the past decade from an estimated 12.3% in 2010 to over 18% in 2023. So, again, this aggregate regional figure hides wide disparities, both within countries and between countries. So the MENA region is home to among the wealthiest countries in the world, such as Qatar and the UAE. At the same time, conflict countries are really experiencing severe hardship. In Syria, for example, and Yemen, over 85% of the population are currently living in poverty, unable to make ends meet or put food on the table. Turning to food, actually, many of these countries are also suffering from inflation and food price inflation, especially. These are severe cases in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and these are obviously disproportionately affecting the poor. And these countries in conflict, not only does this conflict create problems in terms of food insecurity at household level, it also creates havoc with the agricultural systems in these countries. And many of these countries were food exporters. So they also affect kind of this food supply within the region. The MENA region actually is a large importer of food, one of the largest in the world. So this gives you a sense of what the situation entails. Looking at, so that's kind of the overall economic situation, and this cascades. So this kind of situation that reflects in economic opportunities. For example, let's take young people. When the economic situation isn't doing well, and you don't have economic activity, and you have issues of inequality and poverty, it means that young people don't have economic opportunities, or women, or other groups that have difficulty in accessing or being included in the economic activities of the country. So, for example, youth unemployment rates across the decade have been the highest in the world. Currently, they stand at 25% in the region, and that's actually an improvement from over 30% at one point in time. And you can look at education systems and the fact that they're not giving, young people the skills that they need. You can look at demographic pressures that have hit the region. But essentially, I think the bottom line, really, it's been mostly weak economic opportunities, weak connections to global supply chain, government development models, which when they work are great, but when they don't, create problems where the government is actually competing and crowding out the private sector. In fact, you have an overregulation of the private sector and a lack of a level playing field. And that creates difficulty for the formal private sector to grow. And that's where the jobs are that pay good wages and have good benefits and have good social protection. And you end up with young people, over 75% actually then accessing jobs in the informal sector. And that also places the region at an inability to deal with coming to the challenges that you mentioned. So what are the challenges? Sorry. That was my end. There was some fire alarm thing, but that stopped. So looking at the challenges, if you start thinking of the challenges that are facing the world, such as climate change, and you overlap that with the challenges of the region in terms of the agricultural sector, the region is also the most stressed region in the world, a water-stressed region in the world, by far more water-stressed than, say, sub-Saharan Africa. So these overlay so these global challenges become compounded in the context of a region that doesn't have a dynamic economy. Same thing with, let's say, the challenge of digital transformation, which is essentially transforming the world of work. It's transforming how people interact. A region that isn't well integrated and not well developed, and where skills are falling behind the rest of the world, is not able to take advantage of those transformations. And so, let's say the global challenges that we face can either be an opportunity for regions, or they can basically let regions fall further behind. And the fact that the Middle East has these economic problems, they have problems in governance structures, which we haven't even talked about, means that they're not really able to face these global challenges in a good way. And you can see that play out in terms of the large numbers of countries that are not just experiencing economic hardship, but are in the midst of conflict that have raged for decades now, and not being able to get themselves out of these issues, not being able to address the problems that they currently have in order to address the challenge that are expected in the future. I think that's kind of the situation in a nutshell. Maybe we can talk a bit about possible solutions, or where we can go next, or what kind of alternatives the region has going forward, and the next round of questions. Thank you, Marwa.
Thank you so much, Nader. That's really a great overview of what's going on in the region. I want to ask Gladys another question that's a little bit more, again, kind of a symptom of the crisis that we're seeing right now, which is informality and informal employment. So in your most recent World Bank report, which focuses on informal employment and economic growth in the MENA region, it was really interesting, and it's a very eye-opening report I read with great interest, and I thought that was and in the way we used to think about informality and informal employment as an opportunity. And this report kind of paints a very different picture. It's not necessarily, it has its positive aspects, but it also has many negative aspects that are actually impacting the growth that Nader was talking about. So I would like to hear more from you about the prevalence of informal employment, and also the incentive structures that's actually driving these informal employment practices in the MENA region.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion, panel. As you mentioned, Marwa, we just released this report on informality in the region. It was released in the summer, and it paints a very important, I mean, as Nader was saying, I mean, it's a region with a lot of challenges. I will add one challenge to this, which is access to data. And it took us a while in order to put together this report, because precisely the type of information that we needed in order to be able to describe, depict the situation of informality was difficult to access. So let me share with you a screen, I mean, like a PowerPoint the report. I hope you can see it there. And so as Nader was saying, it's a region with a high informality, and informality overall in the world is high. I mean, here is the informality is defined as not having access to social security. And by this measure, for instance, overall in developing world, it's about 63% for men and 58% for women. In the case of the MENA region, based on the definition that we use in the report, I'm not just putting here as an example, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia stands at 65, 77, and 43% respectively. And what is, let me see if I, something, yeah, sorry. By this measure, in the Middle East, in the MENA region, nearly 2 out of 3 workers hold an informal job, which, as I mentioned to you, is a job that doesn't come with social security benefits. Also, it is important in the report, we try to make a distinguish, to try to distinguish between what is measured as legal or illegal informal employment. And this is extremely important because as we argue in the report, the informality is the result of laws, regulations, and institutions that shape this outcome. And these, of course, these laws, regulations, institutions are not the same across the board. It varies a lot by countries. So you will see that according to both de facto and de jure in Egypt, in terms of what firms or workers need to comply, it's very different from Tunisia. So that's also why it took a lot this report, because we really try to understand the underpinnings of laws and regulations and institutions and how this affected labor market status of workers. So by this measure, you see that the size of what is called illegal informal employment is much higher in Egypt relative to Morocco and Tunisia. Because as I was mentioned, what it says in the law and actually how countries are complying with this law and regulation. So in terms of characteristics, something that also caught our attention in the report is that we also see some fluidity in the transition of workers going from formal to informal. And this is, I mean, of course, there is data limitations because we couldn't do this exercise for all countries, but just to have an example, in the case of Egypt, that there is some fluidity in terms of, what we have at the job market status in 1 year respect to others, because what is important to understand is that informality in the MENA region is not only the result of it's a combination of choice, but also of people that cannot be cannot for various reasons, skills, or cannot be in a formal labor market job. Another interesting finding from the report is that usually we think that informality is only constrained to the poor. But informality in the MENA region is pervasive along the welfare distribution. So although informal employment is more prevalent in poor households, with informality rates about 70% alone in the lowest welfare deciles, this doesn't disappear among middle class or more affluent households, where we still see informality rates between 17 and 50%. And here I just want to say that, of course, there is a lot of variation, as Nader said, in the MENA region. But here we are trying to constrain to non-oil producers. But, you know, they are fairly developed countries. So it gives a very good understanding of the situation of informality. Another characteristics of informality in the region is that is prevalent in small firms, which comprise most of the production landscape of the countries. Also is more prevalent in men than women, but it's because women also work in more precarious or vulnerable sectors. And as Mark was saying, informality is very interesting because it's a continuum, I will say, in the case of these countries and some other countries we have studied. It's not just like you are informal or not. As we said, I mean, people are informal, some not in some other, or, you know, it's a more a fluid concept. Also, informality is comprised more of employees rather than self-employment, as this is widely believed in the region. And I said it's more prevalent in small firms. Also, youth workers are more likely to be informal compared to other cohorts. And then it's interesting that although we see that there is a negative relationship between education levels and informality, because of the shrinking of the public sector in some of these countries, then it is start to be high also among you know, tertiary education individuals. So the scope of the report, as I mentioned to you, we try different frameworks, but in our view, there is not one single factor that determines informality. In fact, there is a set of relations that at the end affect informality. And this is why we took this approach of legislations and institutions, and really took the time to understand how this set of relationships work in these countries in terms of entrepreneur-worker relationships. So we look into detail at the social protection system in these countries, the labor regulations, hiring and firing, minimum wage, enforcement. And also we look in depth at the tax and transfer system to understand, you know, both at the household and at the firm level, how these regulations apply. And also, as Nader said, something very important is the market conditions, you know, competition, trade, macro, exports, how these affect at the end regulations, and of course, informality status. So at the end, what the report does is that the interaction of these social protection, taxation policies, and market conditions is that generates this low-level equilibrium that is result of informality. And this is very important what you said, Marwa, because certainly, I mean, for some segment of the population, informality is the only resort. For other population, is a choice because of all these regulations that they don't see much value with respect to the cost. But then at the end, this generates a very bad equilibrium in terms of hindering, social protection coverage of the population, productivity, competitiveness, and growth. So that, I mean, I can talk more about each one of these issues, but I think that might go into your second question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gladys. That was a great overview on informality and what drives informality in the region. I think in the second part of the roundtable, I want to focus it more on the local aspect of these challenges. So as we know, the GLD is mainly focused on local communities and local issues. And I would love to take this it's a very nice intro about what's going on in the region on the macro level. So I wanna push my panelists a little bit, bring you a little bit more local and think together about the challenges, for instance, Nader, that you talked about in the first question. So I want to know more about, and I understand that the challenges for both of you getting this a local level data and the data quality when we talk about even more more localized of issues. But I'm very interested to know, what do we know about the differential effects of these economic crises that you were mentioning, Nader, on local communities? So do these challenges impact these minority groups, thinking about women, children, local communities, those at the periphery, or those in rural versus urban areas? Like, would these crises or challenges affect them differentially?
Hi, Maro. Yes, I think absolutely. I think you have some very, this gets to the crux of the issue, I think. So like you said, let's think out loud about some of these issues. I'll use maybe some data, but a lot of times maybe anecdotal. As Gladys said, data is a big issue in this region, and the more disaggregated you go, the less you really know what's really going on. Let's start with, for example, and I think that this might be a good way to start. Let's look at the issue of women. So women in the Middle East, in terms of their economic participation, their labor force participation is the lowest in the world, and it's been the lowest in the world for as long as we've had data. Currently, participation rates are less than 20%. They're probably around just even under 19%. And compare this to the world average, that's much closer to 50% across all the regions. The Middle East is by far the lowest. Not only that, if you look at unemployment rates among women, across the region, they're around 17%. And this is against just under 6% worldwide. And for men, it's not as bad. It's around 8%, so less than half, against the same average worldwide, around 6%. So this is what this means. That means that, women, not only are they participating less, those who are participating are finding it more difficult to find the kind of work that they want. Even though there are fewer participating, they're actually finding it more difficult to find the kind of work they want. So let's take this, and this is across the region. Most countries, you see these low rates. I'm going to dig a little bit, because we're talking about local stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about a country that I worked in before the civil war, which was Syria. And what you saw was a drop in female participation rates in Syria from over 20%, around 23%, down to under 15% between, let's say, 2000 and 2010, before the crisis. This was a fall, and you saw this drop also in Jordan and other countries. So not only were the participation rates low, they were actually declining over time. And this is at a time when economic opportunities were increasing in the country. Economic growth was solid, inequality was falling, poverty rates were falling. And, I was part of a research center, and we're like, what's going on here? We got to figure this out. So obviously we get in the car and we go visit some rural areas and talk to the women, because the national data is going to tell you there's something going on. And what we found by and large were, well, first of all, we did look at the data. And part of the reason for the fall was because women were actually doing a lot better in school. They were actually staying in school longer. They were graduating from universities at higher rates than men even. And this is also across the region. So part of this is a good news, is that women have actually reached parity in terms of educational attainment among men in the region, and they're in the process of actually passing them, especially at the tertiary level, which is good. But this is not translating into economic inclusion. So we went to these rural areas because most of this phenomenon was taking place in the rural communities. This is what we found. This drop was mostly a rural situation. So we talked to women in several rural communities we worked in, and they were like, yeah, we stopped really working in the fields because, two reasons. The men were doing better in their work because the economic situation was improving, and because honestly, we didn't feel like we wanted to put in the amount of work. It's their responsibility. So we were shocked. It was actually a woman empowerment story. Women were actually becoming more empowered and making more decisions, and the household was improving overall, and they were making a choice not to work. Now, we can get into whether that's a good thing or a bad thing discussion. That's a key component, but it was much more complicated than we initially thought. Now, what's happening is actually the reverse. In difficult economic times, you tend to see these female unemployment rates, female labor force participation rates increase. And you saw that in Syria as well. After the crisis, women were more likely to be working, more likely to be in the labor force. And that's because they were kind of pushed to out of a need to bring in more income to the household, out of a need because men were fighting or fleeing the country. So the reasons for the increases, which were actually quite substantial, were not an indication of strong economic conditions in the ground. It was actually an opposite. So these issues are complicated. So that's what's going on in some context. So going to local communities, you also see that across local communities. There's big divergence between the urban centers across the region and the peripheries, the smaller towns and the smaller cities across the country. And there's differences between rural and urban regions in terms of poverty rates, in terms of unemployment rates, and in terms of economic opportunities. And part of this is the public sector-led development model. I mean, governments tend to be the primary developers of economic activity in these countries, and they tend to focus on the big cities. And even though they have expressed in their national plans their interest in making sure there's equitable growth across the country, and that what happens in fact is that's not what actually happens in fact. You see this in data for Tunisia, you see this in data for Egypt, you see this in data for Syria at the time. In fact, let's say I was mentioning poverty rates declining in Syria before the civil war between 2000 and 2010, declining quite significantly, but not all across the country. There are some regions where the poverty rates did not decline much at all in any significant level. Those tended to be more rural and more peripheral, and those were the regions that tended to actually see the protests that emerged at the beginning. This is where these were the social movements really took root, is in these areas that were being felt they were left behind. We don't see this much in the literature discussed. Usually there's a different story that's being laid out, but that's the story the data tells. So peripheral communities, rural areas are a key element. And this development model that it prioritizes, and I don't think it prioritizes it consciously or deliberately. If you look at national development strategies, that's not the intention. It just prioritizes because that's where the people making decisions are, and that's where the money tends to go. That's where people, the rubber hits the road, so to speak, and so that's where the focus is. But unless there's a deliberate effort on the parts of Middle Eastern governments to reach out to communities that have been left behind, and really not just say, okay, our plans are all great. It's not the planning that's the problem, it's implementation. Make sure that implementation of these plans and development priorities take place in a much more equitable situation across these countries, you are likely to see, to retain the seeds of social social disaffection and potential problems in the future. And you see this across the region, from Morocco and the social unrest that takes place in rural areas, to Tunisia, to other countries. That's a lot of the story that we see in the region.
Thank you so much, Nader, for these insights. I'm going to turn to Gladys, and I want to also ask you the same question about informality and whether it has a differential effect on local communities. So, and also, and again, a second part of the question, which I can follow up for you and Nader. So how can we design strategies that would address adequately these communities? And I think Nader started talking about it, but we can think about it, not just government initiatives, but also international organizations. But before we go there, I want to hear more from you about the differential effect of informality on local communities. I think Nader makes a really great point about, in Syria in particular, about this link between informality and economic conditions, especially among women. So where women tend more to work in fields, and so if their husbands are doing well in the sectors and other economic sectors, so they don't feel the need to go back to work in these sectors, and maybe informal work, like working in the fields, and so it's something that they may choose to do. So I would like to hear more from you. When you're writing these reports and doing this work, did you see similar patterns across women, local communities, and other other groups like that?
No, thank you very much for your question. Well, another one, female labor participation and conflict, also local labor market conditions and female labor participation. And it's extremely interesting because what we see, for instance, on conflict and female labor participation, it depends pretty much on the type of conflict, whether it is persistent. That will affect definitely the response of women. In terms of local labor market conditions, also in another study we recently completed on exports and labor markets, we see that the type of policies, although, for instance, trade liberalization was extremely useful to raise exports and outputs in some of these countries, it had a differential effect across groups and regions. And unfortunately, women lost in these cases. And let me put you an example, because we have a very detailed report that I should have also mentioned here. It's also we just completed in July, is exports to labor markets. What we see there for Morocco and Tunisia is that after the end of the multi-fiber arrangement, Morocco and Tunisia lost their comparative countries. Female workers suffer a lot from this shock, but there was not another industry on which they could move on. And what is interesting in this case is that the policies that were enacted in by the governments really favor more capital-intensive or male-intensive industries. Not at all, but in part also explains the high, the low female labor participation in the region. There has not been policies also designed in order to bring women to the labor force and provide also suitable jobs and help them in the transition when, when an industry downsizes. What next for them, and how is that they could move on into other industries or sectors. And this links to the issue of informality that you were mentioning, because what we see is that in the countries in the MENA region, the systems are not really created in order to increase mobility, no? I'm talking intergenerational mobility, I'm talking, male, women, I'm talking also regional because these systems are very, very rigid, and there are all the incentives to stay in your particular system, because if you move, you lose a lot. And let me just point on a specific example in terms of the social protection and pensions. The way they are designed is basically to reward those that are already in the system and in certain specific sectors. So there are no incentives to join the formal sector, or with the benefits of pension or health, because it's very likely that you won't get it. It will be like a tax for you. You will be paying or contributing, but at the end, you are not going to accrue the time needed in order to be able to get your pension. So this lack of mobility, of course, affects the labor market and affects the outcomes of informality, that many people prefer to stay in informality because they don't see the benefits to join the formal labor market. And that, of course, it cascades into the issue of just making more evident these wide disparities between, urban, rural, between men, women, between public sector and non-public sector workers, between youth and all age populations, because there are certain groups that capture all these benefits, but all these benefits are not shared equally across the population or across geographical areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. Thank you so much. So I think we have a couple of questions from our audience. So I think that one of the questions that Ellen asks here is kind of very close to the third question that I had in mind for both of you, and I started talking about a little bit. She mentions that she would be interested to learn more about any locally driven efforts to alleviate poverty or spur growth that have seen in the region. Which is, again, given your experience and your work with these international organizations, World Bank and other notable organizations. So can you tell us about initiatives or some of these locally driven efforts targeted specifically toward these communities in the MENA region in particular? I can start with Nader, and then if Gladys wants to add something.
Yeah, thank you, Marwa. I think there's a lot of efforts throughout the region to address these issues of poverty and inequality in these disadvantaged areas, and peripheral areas. And I think I'm trying to think of whether these kinds of programs are disproportionately in urban areas or rural areas. I don't know across the region the answer to that question, but I know in some countries they are much more in urban areas. So let me give you an example for one of those countries. Let's say Yemen, again, before the conflict. That's a country where you did see most of the funding. So we say going in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of reaching people in need, tended to have a strong urban bias. It was more difficult to reach rural areas, and it was difficult to serve people in those communities. And one program that I know of, because we were involved in it at the time, was trying to increase access of rural communities, especially young people and young women in rural communities, to microfinance opportunities, to ability to be able to take some, borrow some money, to be able to start a business, and then, help improve their lives and livelihoods. And it's difficult in a place like Yemen and across the region, because these biases, I mentioned the problems of implementation, these biases get ingrained if microfinance institutions aren't lending to young people because they're worried that it's a bigger risk, or if they're not lending to people in peripheral areas because they think maybe there's not enough opportunity for them to really benefit. So this kind of situation perpetuates itself. It becomes ingrained in whatever institutional policies there are. It takes an effort to kind of break the cycle. And in the case of Yemen, for example, there was one, the organization I was working with actually created an incentive program for the donors, for the microfinance institutions to reach out to groups that weren't getting those access to those funding, specifically young men and young women, especially young women, and in rural areas. And by providing some sort of kind of guarantees, saying that, okay, you guys, they're going to microfinance institutions, you're saying these people are at a higher risk. And so, we're going to cover the excess risk up to a certain point. So it incentivizes those institutions to take a chance. And guess what? The repayment rates and default rates for these supposed higher risk groups were similar to the adults and people in urban areas. They weren't any different. That incentivized these microfinance institutions, even without the guarantees, then to go ahead and increase their service to these areas and increase to these services to these communities that were underserved. And that's to me a very big success. Not only did the institutions that we worked with increase their access, what happened was that other institutions saw that what they were doing. And when this organization started, no institution, for example, was reaching out to these communities. One did, after the other saw what was going on, but within 5 years, 9 institutions, microfinance institutions, were reaching out and had special projects and special programs and special lending facilities for these groups. Because again, they saw something happening and they're like, oh, we want to be part of this. So what does this mean? To me, it says that there are these kinds of reaching people in need, reaching peripheral areas involves not just increasing investments in infrastructure and outreach. It really means getting opportunities out there and demonstrating that these opportunities can be converted positively by people living in these areas. And that isn't just about passing a law or starting a project. It's actually about creating the right incentives for these institutions to take a chance and reach those commitments. So that's one example. There's other examples throughout the region, I think, that have been quite successful, but that's one that I worked on and that I know firsthand actually made a difference.
Great, thank you so much, Nader. So Gladys, and I think this is again this question, if you know of some locally driven efforts, or as the question that I posed to you earlier about the role of international organizations. So especially when it comes to assisting local communities, can you think about some of these strategies? You already talked a little bit about the strategies in your presentation, but also, are there anything specific to the local communities?
No, thank you, Marwan. And I just wanted to refer to a point Nader was saying is, I think it's very important in designing programs to think about the incentives, because what we came aware during this informality report is that sometimes good intentions lead to bad outcomes, in the sense that there has been a proliferation of programs or very tiny or small programs to certain populations. At the end, it increased to the segmentation of these groups and the lack of mobility. And let me put an example. I had it here, and it's in the report in the case of Tunisia. When you segment the population in terms of poverty status, vulnerability, and type of benefits, you see that, for instance, the poor might not have an incentive to join the formal labor market because they have to give up their conditional cash transfer program, because that's in the rules of the program, which we suggest in the report. I mean, you don't have to make this. I mean, they should keep it because it should be related to the poverty status and not to the labor market status. So it's important to design programs that are incentive compatible in order to encourage the mobility of people along the income distribution or geographically, and don't lock them up perpetually in a certain status. Definitely, conditional cash transfer programs or the CCDR type of programs, the community development approaches, had the idea to provide like a first push, no? In the case of conditional cash transfer, is to support the family in order to accumulate human capital so that eventually these children can use this human capital in the labor market and move up. The same with CCDRs. The idea is to help develop the community, the production base of the community in order to be able to grow and to be part of a larger market. So they are meant to be programs to help transition these populations or communities in order to be part of a larger market or population group. So definitely, I think we should design this in mind. And as we said in the report, we try to provide a roadmap based on the characteristics and incentives to provide a roadmap in terms of what we suggest or we think countries should pursue. But first, as I mentioned, is to take stock and to take stock of the big picture and to understand how is the incentives working, and then start tackling those low-hanging fruits. And in the report, we said, why don't you start with, health, ensure that there is health access of good coverage for everyone in terms of quality and quantity. Then to try to move to fix or improve the situation of the pension system, but also along this, ensure that there is a social pension, particularly for the poor, who are more prone to fall into old age poverty. And after these basic conditions, then there has to be some changes in the way laws and regulations work in the tax and redistribution system in order to make these changes affordable. But also there has to be some changes in terms of the realm of market to encourage competition, to encourage openness, to encourage increase in productivity. And above all, I think to ensure that the benefits of growth or benefits of other policies not only stay in certain groups, but can be distributed to the entire population. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys, so much. So we have 5 minutes left, and there's one question that I think that comes from our audience as well, about how much does the nature of soil quality and fertility affect communities' experience with economic crises? And I think here the argument is thinking about at least some arguments that drought led to strife in Syria before the civil war. So how is this playing out in the current context of inflation and food pressures, in part given the Russia-Ukraine war? I think Nader, this refers a little bit to your comment about the Syrian context and how it looked like before the civil war. So do you have insights about how the drought or the soil quality impacted these crises?
Generally, there is this big literature out there, and that is making a connection between climate change and drought and increased conflict, and it's the evidence is quite actually, as far as I can see, strong. You can see this potentially playing out. One of our colleagues here at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs is writing a paper currently on the situation in Sudan, essentially, and how climate change together with drought is feeding the conflict and vice versa. The conflict is actually creating more of a problem there. So I think there's a strong evidence there. The region itself is highly water stressed, as I mentioned, the most water stressed in the world. It's also the most conflict-prone region in the world. This is not a good mix. Add in lack of economic opportunities, and it goes back to my opening statement about why there's some serious challenges ahead in the coming decade for the region that we need to be very serious about thinking about how to resolve them. Going to the Syria crisis, that said, before the conflict between 2007 and 2010, there was a drought that affected the country mostly, but especially the northeast part of the country. And there was a migration of around 300,000 people from that area because of the drought. So it was a big deal. And people have drawn that link, but at least one paper, and I forgot the right citation, but there's one paper out there that looked at it very carefully and determined that the empirical evidence wasn't really there. By 2010, the drought was essentially over. The areas where you saw the protests in Syria that emerged were not the areas where drought had affected the country. They were actually in other areas, and the reasons seemed to be more political than driven by reduced resources such as soil fertility and economic opportunity. As I mentioned, poverty rates were going down, inequality was actually going down, economic growth was fairly robust. The key indicators that were going in the opposite direction was perception of corruption was increasing, the political issues of the country were becoming more problematic. And in fact, it was the regime's response to the early protests that seemed to have ignited and then led the conflict to spread much more than the reasons for the protests to begin with. The protests seemed to start because other people were protesting across the region in Egypt and Tunisia. And so it was kind of like, the fire was kind of spreading and it caught, but then that was how it was dealt with. I think the case of Syria isn't one that supports that narrative, but the narrative itself, there's a lot of evidence for it. And again, I mean, hopefully we'll get the Sudan paper done within the next few, month or so and release that because it's really interesting. And it's going to be a key component of our thinking about how these crises or these challenges, they're not standalone challenges, they're actually interconnected. And so one challenge you can deal with, but lay over another challenge over that's interconnected to it, and a third challenge over that's interconnected, and suddenly you have a problem that's much more difficult to resolve. And I think that's the issues facing the region. So it's a very good point that was raised, and I agree with it. And I just want to say that maybe the Syria case isn't the best example of it.
Okay, we have 1 minute left, and I want to leave. I feel like I want to leave this roundtable with a positive note. So I think we talked about a lot of crises and a lot of problems. So I think I will give each one of you like 30 seconds to tell me one thing that like countries you pick, what the countries, specific countries, set of countries, that one immediate strategy or one immediate solution that needs to happen. So that would have a big effect on you say local communities or even populations more generally. Just one thing that you think that it may make a big difference in your own opinion as one of our very esteemed policy experts. I'll start with Gladys. If you can think about one thing that you think needs to be immediately done.
Well, I guess because I have been working on this, but I think certainly is the issue of social pension. I think the region really needs to start thinking because of the circumstances we just spoke about. In terms of, low female labor participation, high informality. I think the region really needs to put emphasis in improving their pension system with an eye towards designing a well-targeted social pension that helps to preempt the issue of old age poverty.
Thank you. That's great. Nader, what do you think?
I mean, I sometimes ask myself this question: if I had $1 billion, where would I invest it? Honestly, I think it would be something like Women's Development Bank or something like that. I think the region, as I mentioned, has the lowest rates of human participation in the world. This translates also to lack of economic opportunities for women. In many countries, no data on this, but for what little data I could find is women own a very small percent of assets, probably less than 5% of land, for example, and things like this. So there's a lot of issues here to focus on women that can be addressed not with access only to finance and opportunities like that, but also something like this would be empowering. I want to leave it also with a positive note. A lot of the region's development center of gravity has shifted to the Gulf, and the Gulf actually has some interesting examples to share, especially with regard to women. They're now excelling in education. They're graduating at at a much higher rate than men from schools. They're actually, in terms of women, this is not overall women in the Gulf, living in the Gulf, but this is female nationals, so with citizenships. Their labor force participation rates in many countries of the Gulf is now higher than 50%. It's higher than the world average compared to the region, which is much lower than the world average. And that's because the opportunities are there, not just in the public sector, but even in countries that are increasing their nationalization of the private sector, women are accepting jobs in the private sector. And the reason is, and I come to Gladys's point, because those jobs are formal sector jobs. They're formal private sector jobs that women are willing to take and can gain, don't have less discrimination in, and they have opportunities for advancement in, much more than, let's say, the informal sector that we see in other countries. So the idea of formalization plays a big role in seeing this positive development within the Gulf countries that I think share many of the social norms and many of the issues that other countries in the region face, and show that very much these can be easily overcome with the right kind of incentives, as Gladys said, and the right kind of formal economic opportunities in the formal sector. And I think an increasing role for women in society can have a positive impact across the wide region, and we need to learn from the successes of wherever we can find them. In this case, I have a paper out with Najla bin Maymoun that came out 1 year ago that looks at this issue in the Gulf. If people want to look at it, or on our website, and shows how this translated. So that's, I guess, my one positive comment.
That's great. Thank you so much. We are only 3 minutes over time, so that's a record for me. So thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to get to know you and know more about your work. And we hope that you can join us again in future roundtables. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Marwa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys.
The organization.
It was.
Bye.